Professor Shin. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for the generous introduction and also for having me here today. I'm very happy to be here joining wonderful speakers whose work I'm excited to discuss later on today. I understand it's the last day of today's workshop, and I have my admiration and respect for all of you who've been here for the last 2 days. I know what it feels like, and I had a 2 full-day Zoom meeting as part of my school committee work just a few weeks ago. It was very exhausting. So, but I hope the session, the next in a few hours with our wonderful papers to be presented will give you a bit more stimulation before you enter the weekend. What I'm going to say for the next, I guess, maximum 15 minutes. I guess I have my time until 20 past the hour. So will be about decentering and recentering the urban studies. And this is largely going to be based on a chapter I have produced for the forthcoming book by Colin McFarlane and Michele Lancioni. So a bit of a taster of what has gone into the chapter. So let me just do the screen sharing. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. Great. So I guess the first thing to say is, like, I mean, many of you would have seen and probably played around with Google Books Ngram Viewer to see how popular a certain expression has been in the literature, especially those the corpora provided by or accumulated by the Google. And I was just kind of playing around with this the other day, and global urbanism, as you can see, becoming increasingly popular towards the from the end of 1990s, and it wasn't popular up until basically in the 1990s, right? So I think this all again is provides an interesting context, intellectual context within which we discuss dislocating urban studies. A good starting point will be Anya Roy's proposition here, which says the concern is the limited site at which theoretical production is currently theorized, and with the failure of imagination and epistemology that is thus engendered. So I guess this is something many of us who are here today, and including the organizers of this event, will be more or less sharing. So I guess we don't need to go too much into this. What I'm trying to say, and this is my first part, is what it means to think about decentering urban studies by taking the global south into consideration. So I guess one emphasis can be made on the importance of making use of southern cities as new sites of theorizing, which kind of speaks to what Anya Roy has said just now. So in this case, decentering the production of knowledge on global urbanism involving moving away from over-reliance on Western cities, like those global cities, so-called the top-tier cities of London, Chicago, Vancouver, that frequently feature in our urban studies literature. And no longer treating these as the only site of theoretical inspiration, but thinking of how southern cities can make the contributions. And of course, again, the Jenny Robinson's The Ordinary Cities, which emphasize the importance of placing cities on all the cities on the level playing field, will be again what we can remind ourselves. And in this line, we get to hear in more recent years these new expressions. For example, Oren Iftaker, in a conference that was held in UCL in 2019, just 2 years ago, trying to propose the expression theorize with essay in capital letters to refer to Southeast. And for him, this refers to that particular region that sits somewhere between Africa, Central Asia, and Southern Europe, to refer to how the regional understanding can make some qualitative differences to the ways in which we understand urban studies, especially in terms of post-colonizing, the post-colonial urban studies. And we also get to hear another expression, global East, and gaining some momentum, especially by means of having this concept being promoted among researchers working on Central and Eastern Europe. So we have Martin Müller's paper 2017 that refers to that particular region as the global East, and this was one of the major, I guess, debating points in a conference that was held in Kiev in Ukraine 3-4 years ago. Before that, and I was also referring to and making use of the global East, and in my case, in this article that came out a year ago, before Martin Müller's, to refer to the importance of looking at East and Southeast Asia as a way of disrupting these binaries between global South and the global North. That has been very much in a starting point of our discussions of urban studies for some years. And here, I guess, some persistent problems I can share with you. On the one hand, there is still the absence of an underrepresentation of certain global regions. So the fact that these theorized or global East, and the fact that they are being raised are largely because these are seen to be and continue to be underrepresented or absent in our discussions. And this poses a particular problem because when you think of how the publication industry or the academic industry works, there are often challenges researchers may face when they are trying to focus on certain regions which are perceived to be absent or underrepresented. I was looking at the recent publication by 2 South Korean scholars who are based in Canada, so Jae-suk Song and Hae Lam, who have published an edited volume about urban South Korea and the experience of how urban South Korea can be reflected upon and using it as a way of making contributions to post-colonial urban studies, as well as studies that come from based on the experience of the non-Western cities. What they have very interestingly shared in their book, in the introduction and preface, is the fact that they went through many years of rejections when they were trying to propose a special issue, for example, that was making use of South Korea as the main site of theorizing. And the response they usually received was basically, it needs to be more comparative. It needs to include more cases, not just in South Korea only, and which was basically beating the purpose in the first place when it comes to deep contextualization of one particular case that has been underrepresented and making use of it to challenge the existing conceptualization of certain theories. This is not quite the same when you look at studies that are looking at Chinese urban studies or Chinese urbanism. We get to hear quite a few special issues which are looking at China as the main site of inquiry. And that has been well received for many years, since the 1990s, during the last 2 decades. And there's a reason to that, I guess. There's a market that many publishing industries and academic institutions are trying to exploit or delve into. And the rise of China as one of the economic powerhouses also increasing the chance of expanding academic market that many Western academic institutions may want to dip into. And therefore, China becoming one of the major frequently cited case studies that can be part of the entire special issue, for example. So you have all kind of different degree of experiences within non-Western regions in terms of how they are able to be received by the existing publishing industries. And the second part is the binary thinking of the global north and the global south. And I guess it is already needless to say that the global north and south distinctions are, while they are still having some utilities and usefulness, but I guess such binary is increasingly becoming difficult and proven to be inadequate to incorporate the varying degree of experiences across the world. And here, I guess I can just go back to how East Asia, for example, can always be a little difficult category to fit into any one. So it'll be quite challenging to come across with any urban studies literature that will be placing South Korea or Taiwan together with other cities from the global north and group them all to be part of global north, despite the fact that Taiwan and South Korea will be very much one of the most industrialized economies as of now. But at the same time, the fact that they can't be part of the global north intuitively doesn't mean they are part of global south either, especially when you look at these Asian economies in the late 20th century or early 21st century. And they are difficult to be part of the global south, which have a typical kind of conceptualization. And this also probably is the reason why scholars like Martin Müller have also been grappling with the concept of global east, where Central and Eastern Europe finding themselves difficult to fit into any of the global north or global south. They are, according to what Martin Müller was saying, they are too rich to be part of global south, but too poor to be part of global north, or also having gone through the trajectory of post-socialist transition, placing themselves on a very different developmental trajectory from the rest of so-called global north economies. And when you try to recenter urban studies, I guess there's also some challenges that I want to share here with the audience. So when it comes to recentering urban studies by focusing on cities outside the North Atlantic, and here I want to go back to what I was just saying now. There's a funders and publishers hesitation to support studies on a non-Western single site, right? So comparative studies, can you bring together a number of disparate cases to produce a comparative endeavor? It's always probably almost always 9 out of 10 cases of proposals being made to journals. That will be the response that you may often receive. There's also a risk of giving prominence to a small number of prime cities, especially those cities which are smaller and more regional, which are dropped off the map of not only investors, but also they are dropped off the map of many scholarly inquiries as well. So we get to see the proliferation of studies that are focusing on the so-called core cities, right? So here, I guess you can, some of you in the slides that I want to share as a way of kind of provoking our thinking is going back to the Google Books Ngram viewer, and you can see in how Chinese urbanism, for example, has become quite popular expression that can be found in the literature. African urbanism as well, also becoming increasingly popular or re-emerging after the surge of interest in the 1960s and 70s during the decolonization period, right? As the independence gained momentum, a lot of attention being paid to the continent. Now, what can be also interesting here is how can you how do you understand the rise of Chinese urbanism or the African urbanism? And in this regard, we don't really get to hear, say, for example, Korean urbanism or Malaysian urbanism, Indonesian urbanism. they are all kind of grouped together on the, say, for example, Southeast Asian urbanism, right? Whereas Chinese urbanism itself on its own has gained popularity to an extent that the popularity of the expression exceeds that of African urbanism or Asian urbanism as a whole. What is interesting here is, and when you actually look at this map, and an interesting infographic that shows the relative size of different countries and how they fit into Africa, right? So in a sense, this is where we can think of how often we see ourselves using the expression African urbanism as if Africa is an homogeneous entity, right? And there are frequent complaints and dissatisfaction coming from African scholars, where Africa is a vast and heterogeneous the continent, and what happens in South Africa, for example, which stands very prominently in the urban studies literature, cannot be representing what goes on in the rest of the continent. And you can probably see why that makes complete sense if you think of especially how these different countries can all fit into the African continent. So when you talk about Chinese urbanism, that it will be only a very small part of one part of Africa, for example, in terms of territorial size. But as many geographers will say, the uneven geography that plays out within China itself is quite vast and quite presents many challenges to researchers. And the same can be even more strongly pronounced and emphasized when it comes to how we approach the topic of so-called African urbanism. And of course, the global urbanism has come to be very important, largely because of the rise of the literature and understanding of the world cities from the 1980s onward in particular, and how this conceptualization of world cities has also contributed to the absence of some cities which are lying outside the core system of the world cities network. And already in 2004, another interesting paper by Short, who was referring to how many of the mega cities are still completely being absent in the literature or in the discussion of the world cities in particular, and remaining as black hole cities despite the largest size of population that they come to accommodate, like Tehran and having 10 million population, or Dhaka, and again, another 10 million population city, not really part of the world cities literature, and therefore being absent in urban studies literature. And in this case, when you go back to John Friedman's the world city hypothesis paper in 1986, you get to see basically the handful number of cities which are occupying the core positions and which are still continuing to be very much the site of theorizing when it comes to urban studies. So London, Madrid, Paris, where especially London, Chicago, New York, Tokyo, and will be the main sites of theorizing, especially Chicago, London, and New York from the West. And these are largely the cities that we still come to observe, right? So in South Korea, you don't get to hear much about other cities. So this is another interesting gridded population cartogram, which shows the equal population projection. So each area that you see, Seoul, Daegu, Busan, which are top cities in terms of the size of economy and population in South Korea, shown as a proportion to the number of people living there, showing Seoul itself, by the way, occupies less than 1% of the territory in South Korea, whereas the size of population is about accounting for about 20%, more than 20% of the South Korea. And therefore, this also shows, on the one hand, it is important to understand South Korea by looking at the city of Seoul, but at the same time, it also skews our understanding towards Seoul, so-called Seoul urbanism, right? And that becoming the representation of Korea when it comes to our understanding of what goes on in terms of urbanization and urbanism in the country of Korea. We don't get to hear about in Busan or elsewhere, or Ulsan, industrial city in Korea when it comes to thinking about the rise of urbanism, particular type and the forms of urbanism in the Korean context. And this is, and that kind of relation understanding going beyond the domain of the methodological statism or nationalism was the kind of theme in these authors on the right-hand side who produced the book Developmentalist Cities were trying to highlight. But I think there's a long way to go from here. The same goes to China, the same in a graded population cartogram showing the importance of cities like Beijing, Hong Kong, Shanghai. And these are the usual lenses that we often use and how the studies are constructed when it comes to understanding the forms of urbanism and the process of urbanization within China. But of course, there are many others which are emerging to become important cities. And I think there's a need of having a balance between studies on major core cities of Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, or Hong Kong, and the studies on other cities. I guess that speaks to the main, the ethos of the workshop today. So the final point here, and let me conclude. So another theme, final point is whether critical urban scholarship can be seen as a dominion of the global north. And here, I'm speaking about this as a person from South Korea who is working in one of the global north institutions. So there's a dilemma myself. But I think there's a need of developing, nurturing, and excavating scholars who are based and working in the global, so-called global south, right? Working together in healthy, collaborative relationship with scholars who can be supportive of their endeavor while being based in the global north. So I'm taking this one as an example because although I'm part of the International Advisory Board of the Antipode and I like the journal, I had my paper published in the journal, but when this book came out to mark the 50 years of Antipode, published in, I think, 2019 or 20, including many scholars who are each of them addressing a particular keyword, so 50 keywords in this case. All of them, apart from just one person who was part of the co-authors, were basically scholars based in global north, right? New Zealand, Australia, UK, US, Canada, and one or two European countries. So all these critical engagement with certain concepts to advance the radical geography written about by scholars in the global north. And I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of how we approach the decentering of urban studies, which has to be involving, again, I go back to what I was saying, developing, nurturing, and excavating the scholarship carried out by scholars in this global south without falling into some sort of methodological nationalism or some very crude decolonizing effort that somehow, without critically engaging, highlighting uncritically what comes out from the global south itself. So there needs to be some healthy critical engagement, but I think there's a lot more room to develop when it comes to thinking about how to dislocate or decenter urban studies. So as a summary, let me just emphasize the third point: process-oriented thinking necessary, taking into account the hybridization of endogenous and exogenous moment, and comparative understanding that examines both historical legacies and the processes of how geopolitical relations play out, and avoiding giving supremacy to the Western model, but also avoiding the danger of falling into regional exceptionalism is what I want to say. as a concluding comment. So thank you so much.